Welcome back. The next tool in the toolbox is consequences. When parents take this course, they immediately want to jump straight to consequences. What we know, though, is that consequences are really not that effective unless we're doing the groundwork, which means addressing our kids' needs for belonging and significance. The tools we've talked about so far will boost your kids' feelings of belonging and significance. They lay the groundwork for better behavior. And as you're using them consistently, your kids are feeling more empowered rather than overpowered. So with that said, if you're in this lesson but you haven't completed all of the lessons that precede it, please go back to session 1 and work through all the sessions in order. Trust me, you will be so glad that you did. The tools in this course are designed to build on each other, and you'll get much better results from consequences if you're consistently using the foundation tools first. And here's the really great news. If you're consistently using the positive, empowering tools you've learned, you shouldn't have to use consequences all that often. In fact, hardly ever, because the misbehaviors are becoming fewer and farther between. Now, the reality is, as we're working through this process, we do have to use consequences from time to time, but let's talk about what consequences are not, and then we'll define consequences more clearly. If I were to ask the average person on the street what they think of when they hear the word punishment, they'd probably mention spanking or yelling or grounding, basically making the child pay or suffer for something that he did. From a positive discipline perspective, we define punishment as anything that adds blame, shame, or pain to the child. So certainly yelling, like we heard in The Competent Giant, would be considered punishment. And spanking, these are all hurtful things to the child, either emotionally or physically. Punishment, again from a positive discipline and an Adlerian perspective, is focused on a past behavior. You did X, and therefore you're going to be punished for it. Punishment is intended to make the child pay for their mistake. Punishment is very much part of the overpower paradigm because the adult is taking advantage of their physical size or their power over the child. Punishment is also fear-based. Basically, the adult places enough fear in the child with the hope that he won't do that behavior for fear of the punishment that might occur after the fact. Blame, shame, and pain punishment is flawed on many counts, but let me share 5 of them with you. Number 1, because punishment operates from fear, it actually encourages kids to lie. Lying to get out of a punishment is actually a perfectly reasonable kid response, right? Who would want to come clean and be honest when they know that blame, shame, and pain is going to follow? In fact, adults lie for the exact same reason, to avoid an unpleasant outcome. Number 2, we also know that kids who are punished over time, physically or emotionally, often act out with revenge. They've been hurt, and so they try to hurt others. In fact, we'll talk about this in a later session. Number 3, another problem with punishment is it misses the learning opportunity. When a child is being punished with blame, shame, or pain, they're not thinking about their behavior. They're not thinking about how to make a better choice next time. That child is in self-protection mode, protecting himself from the physical or emotional pain. There's no learning going on in that moment. Number 4, it erodes trust in the parent-child relationship. Imagine what goes through a child's mind when he's being physically or even emotionally punished. Aren't these the people who say they love me more than anything in the world? Why would they do this to me? I must be a really bad person. Punishment erodes the relationship. And number 5, punishment breeds anger and resentment. Instead of the child thinking, wow, I better get my act together, I'm never going to do that again, the child's anger turns toward the parent, and then the child can feel perfectly justified in his behavior. This doesn't mean that kids are not held accountable for their behaviors. They certainly are. Once we've taken time for training and set the expectation for what the behavior should be, they are to be held accountable for their choices, and we can use consequences to do that. Punishment and consequences are worlds apart. And piggybacking off of our discussion of punishment, here are 4 reasons why consequences are way more effective than punishment in actually changing behavior. First, Consequences, as we describe them in this course, are part of the empowerment paradigm because they empower the child and they empower the adult. Second, instead of making the child suffer after the fact, consequences are future-oriented, anticipating what may happen in the future, usually based on repeated misbehaviors, and then setting the child up for success. With consequences, kids are expecting to be held accountable, and we do that in a respectful way. Third, consequences allow life to be the big teacher, and that'll be clear in just a few minutes. It takes the parent out of the role of being the bad guy and allows life to teach the lessons. And finally, consequences set kids up for the real world. There are plenty of real-world situations where consequences would come into play, especially in the teen years. When kids learn how to face consequences during childhood, they're more likely to make better decisions down the road. Now, in this course, we're going to learn about two types of consequences. The first type of consequence is called a natural consequence. The second type is a logical consequence. Let's talk about natural consequences first. Natural consequences are something you allow your child to face. Essentially, once you've warned your child in advance about the possibility of a less than desirable outcome, you do nothing, and the consequences play out. For example, if your child wears flip-flops to school on a rainy day in February, she gets cold. If he leaves his toys out in the yard, maybe they get dirty or lost or broken. If she refuses to eat the snack you brought her on the way to piano, well, she gets hungry. If he doesn't study for a test, he'll get a poor grade. The natural consequence is what naturally happens without any adult interference, without reminding or rescuing. The beautiful thing about natural consequences is that they are life's best teacher. You don't have to be the one teaching the life lesson. The experience itself teaches the lesson without any interference or power struggles from you. But using natural consequences requires a lot of courage for parents for a number of reasons. First, our protective instinct doesn't want to let our kids be cold or be uncomfortable. We want them to be safe and warm and snuggly, so we want to remind them to remember their coat. We don't want them to get in trouble or feel embarrassed, so we remind them to remember their sports gear or their homework. Again, we keep talking about this, but our real job is to guide our kids from dependence to independence. So as long as they're old enough to be able to remember their coat on their own or remember their lunchbox on their own, we need to let them do it and allow the natural consequences to play out. The second reason this is difficult for parents is we're concerned about our own image, right? What would other people think if we let our kids go to school in a t-shirt in the middle of winter? What would the teachers think if we didn't drive the homework to school when he forgot it? This is one of those situations, as hard as it may be, to let it go and forget about what other people may think. What's most important is that we're teaching our kids to be responsible for themselves. Natural consequences are really the best teacher, and they allow the child to learn the lesson without a lot of nagging and reminding from you. Now, of course, we want to be sensible about using natural consequences. We aren't going to use natural consequences when it's a hazardous situation. For instance, wearing a bicycle helmet. We're not going to allow the natural consequence to take place for not wearing a bike helmet. That's non-negotiable. Another example might be teeth brushing. In that situation, we're not going to allow the natural consequence to play out because the time between cause and effect is too long, right? We're not going to wait 8 months until the kid develops a cavity for him to realize that he should have brushed his teeth. We're only going to use natural consequences in situations where they make sense. Before letting natural consequences play out, however, it's essential to reveal in advance that you'll no longer be getting involved, meaning no longer rescuing or reminding. And you'll have to make sure your kids know the possible consequences. So if the child frequently forgets the lunchbox and you've been driving it to school, we want to have a conversation at a calm moment of the day and say, you know, you are really growing up and you're old enough now to remember your lunchbox on your own. So from now on, I'm not going to drive your lunchbox to school. If you forget your lunch, you'll have to be hungry or figure out some other plan. But I have complete confidence that you'll be able to remember it. Or here's another example. You are really growing up in so many ways, and so from now on, I'm no longer going to remind you to take your soccer bag or remember your homework. I'm also not going to drive the forgotten homework or the sports equipment to school if you forget it. So if you forget what you need for the day, you'll have to experience the consequences with your teacher or with the coach. Now, if we didn't warn the child that we aren't going to drive those items to school anymore and we just let the consequences play out, that's not fair to them. And you can bet it's going to feel like blame, shame, and pain punishment to your kids. And I promise you, the anger will be directed at you. That warning up front is so important. By revealing in advance what's expected and the fact that you'll no longer be getting involved or rescuing, the child can make the choice. When the natural consequence happens, there are no big surprises, and the child can only be angry with himself. Another important piece of this training is setting the child up for success. You can say, now, since I won't be reminding you about your homework or driving your soccer bag to school if you forget, what can you do to help you remember what you need? Perhaps he needs to get a laminated checklist for his backpack, or put a sign on the door on the way out to the garage, or an alert on his phone. Whatever works to help him be successful without reminders from you. In my second book, The Me, Me, Me Epidemic, I call this the no rescue policy of consequences. But it's important to know that natural consequences and the no rescue policy are for repeated bouts of forgetfulness. Any one of us can make a mistake or forget something, and it's fine to have your kids' backs for the one-off forgetfulness. We're a family and we help each other. But for repeated forgetfulness, it's probably time to put natural consequences in place. There's an expression in parenting education circles that goes like this: a child who forgets has a parent who always remembers. If you always remember for them, there's no reason for them to remember for themselves. Don't rob your child of the opportunity to learn responsibility and accountability. If he doesn't learn it at home where it's safe and the stakes aren't nearly as high, it's going to be a much harder lesson later in life out in the real world if he ever learns it. Now, here are 4 steps in implementing natural consequences. First, as we discussed, reveal the possible consequence in advance. This is absolutely essential. So in a calm moment, warn your child that you'll no longer be getting involved and what the possible consequence might be. Once you've revealed the consequence, make sure your child understands it. And then your job is done. That's the easy part, by the way. Number 2, if the child makes a poor choice, you need to let the natural consequence play out. That's the hard part. Number 3, when your child is upset about the result of the natural consequence, empathize, because it is hard to learn those lessons. But it's so important to use empathy instead of an "I told you so," because that shame will only turn his anger back on us. And number 4, focus on solutions. In addition to showing empathy, you also want to help him find solutions for next time. So in the case of the forgotten lunchbox, it might sound like, wow, that must have been difficult for you not having your lunchbox, sweetie. What can you do differently tomorrow so you're able to remember it? Again, it might be making a note as he's walking out the door. It might be putting the lunchbox and backpack in the car the night before, assuming it's wintertime. Making sure there's a checklist for everything he needs for school. The most important thing is to implement solutions without any blame, shame, or pain so he can be more successful next time. That turns it into a learning opportunity he can feel good about. Now here's a pro tip. This is another example where you can bring teachers and coaches into the loop. That way they can support you in allowing the natural consequences to play out so your kids learn those lessons. Our goal is to train our kids to do better in the future, not to punish them for past behavior. And that's the beauty of natural consequences, because they learn for themselves. And then through training, we help them do it in a different, more effective way in the future. It's all about empowering our children. For those situations in which natural consequences don't make sense, logical consequences may be an option. We'll talk about how to use fair and effective logical consequences in the next lesson. I'll see you there.